The screams tore through the Texas night like rusted metal scraping against bone. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of the old Alton Bridge, his hooved feet planted on weathered wood that had witnessed a century of secrets, and listened to the sound of his own voice echoing back from the darkness below. But it wasn't his voice anymore. Hadn't been for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. It was something else now. Something that lived in the space between animal and human, between nightmare and memory. The girl stood frozen 20 feet away, her phone's flashlight beam trembling across his form, illuminating the matted fur that covered what used to be skin, the curved horns that sprouted from a skull that still held fragments of the man he'd been. Her eyes, wide and reflective in the darkness, reminded him of his daughter's eyes, the last human eyes that had looked at him with recognition instead of terror. That was before the ritual, before the thing in the woods had offered him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Save his dying child or watch her slip away in a sterile hospital room where prayers went unanswered and hope died by degrees. He'd chosen. God help him, he'd chosen. And the price had been everything. His humanity burned away like morning fog under a merciless sun, replaced with this cursed existence, this eternal vigil on a bridge where the boundary between worlds grew thin as spider silk. The girl's scream built in her throat. He could see it, could smell her fear like copper and honeysuckle, and he knew what would happen next because it always happened the same way. They would run, they would tell others, and he would remain caught between the memory of who he was and the monster he'd become. Guardian of a threshold he could never cross, protector of a daughter who thought him dead. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. The transformation had started on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong somehow, too ordinary a day for the end of everything. Thomas Whitmore had been a veterinarian in Denton, Texas, a man whose hands had delivered countless lives into the world, whose voice had soothed frightened animals and their equally frightened owners. He'd had kind eyes, his wife Rebecca used to say, eyes that made people trust him instinctively. Those eyes had watched helplessly as his 8-year-old daughter Emma's leukemia progressed, despite every treatment, every prayer, every desperate bargain he'd tried to make with a God who seemed to have stopped listening. When Marcus Washington, the county sheriff and his oldest friend, had pulled him aside one rain-soaked evening and spoken of something ancient in the woods near Old Alton Bridge, something that granted impossible wishes for impossible prices, Thomas had laughed, had actually laughed, the sound bitter and broken, but desperation has a way of making believers out of skeptics, of turning rational men into seekers of miracles in the darkness. The Old Alton Bridge had earned its local nickname, GOATMAN's Bridge, from stories that predated the structure itself, tales woven from the fears and superstitions of settlers who'd pushed into Texas territory with Bibles in one hand and rifles in the other. The bridge spanned Hickory Creek, a tributary that ran blood-red with iron oxide deposits, creating an unsettling visual that had inspired generations of ghost stories. But Thomas had learned in the worst possible way that some legends root themselves in truth that runs deeper than folklore, deeper than collective imagination. The entity that lived in the woods surrounding the bridge was old, older than the Creek people who'd first whispered its name, older than the Spanish missionaries who'd marked the area as cursed on their maps. It had many names across many cultures, but in Texas, in these particular woods, it was simply known as the Keeper, a being that maintained the membrane between what was and what could be, between life and death, between human and other. Thomas had made his pilgrimage to the bridge on a night when the moon hung swollen and orange, pregnant with the promise of change. He'd left Rebecca sleeping fitfully at Emma's hospital bedside, had driven through darkness that seemed to press against his windshield like living hands, had walked the last quarter-mile because his truck refused to start once he'd reached the tree line. The bridge had appeared suddenly, materializing from shadow and mist, and he'd understood in that moment that he'd crossed a threshold that had nothing to do with geography. The Keeper had been waiting, had perhaps been waiting since before Thomas was born, its form shifting and fluid, sometimes goat, sometimes man, sometimes neither, and both. It had spoken in a voice that sounded like wind through bone, had offered what all desperate fathers would sell their souls to obtain: his daughter's complete recovery, her cancer erased as if it had never existed, her future restored. The price had seemed simple: a life for a life, an exchange of essence. Thomas would take the keeper's place, would become the guardian of the threshold, would assume a form that would allow him to exist in the spaces between. He would no longer be fully human, but he would be eternal, and Emma would live. The keeper had not mentioned that eternity tasted like ashes, that watching humanity from outside its borders was a torture that made physical pain seem like a mercy. Thomas had agreed because what father wouldn't, had placed his hand in the keeper's twisted appendage, had felt reality unmake and remake him in ways that defied description. The pain had been exquisite, every cell rewriting itself, his DNA unwinding and rewinding into patterns that nature had never intended. His bones had lengthened and curved, his spine had reconfigured, his hands and feet had transformed into hooves that clicked against stone with sounds that echoed with wrongness. When it was finished, when Thomas Whitmore the man had died and something else had been born in his place, the keeper had smiled with too many teeth and said the words that would haunt Thomas through endless nights: "Guard the bridge, protect the boundary, and never ever try to cross back." Then it had walked away, had shed its cursed form like an old coat, had become something small and human-shaped that disappeared into the Texas darkness, finally free. The first weeks had been the hardest. Thomas had hidden in the woods during daylight, his new form too monstrous to risk exposure, and had learned the limits of his transformed body during the long, aching nights. He could move with supernatural speed when needed, could see in darkness as clearly as in light, could sense when someone approached the bridge from miles away, a prickling awareness that crawled across his altered consciousness like insects under skin. He had thought in those early days that he might go mad from the isolation, from the knowledge of what he'd become. But then he'd felt it, a golden thread of connection that ran from his heart to wherever Emma was, and he'd known she was alive, was healthy, was laughing with the pure joy of a child who'd been given back her future. That thread became his anchor, the only thing that kept him tethered to purpose when the weight of eternity threatened to crush what remained of his soul. Sarah Chen arrived in Denton on a September afternoon, when the heat still shimmered off the asphalt in visible waves, and the air tasted like dust and desperation. She was 28, a freelance journalist who specialized in American folklore and unexplained phenomena, and she'd been following the trail of GOATMAN sightings with the tenacity of someone who needed to believe in something beyond the mundane cruelty of everyday existence. Her camera bag held equipment worth more than her car. Her notebook contained interviews with 17 witnesses who claimed to have seen the creature, and her heart carried a wound that she'd never quite learned to heal. Her younger brother had disappeared 7 years ago while camping near the bridge. His tent found empty, his belongings untouched, his fate a mystery that police had long since stopped investigating. Sarah had never believed the official explanation, that he'd simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. She'd always known something else had taken him, something the authorities couldn't explain or acknowledge. Marcus Washington had aged 20 years in the 7 since Thomas's disappearance. At 52, he carried the weight of too many unsolved cases, too many families he'd failed, too many nights he'd driven out to Old Alton Bridge and stared into the darkness, wondering if his friend was somehow still alive out there. The official story was that Thomas Whitmore had suffered a mental breakdown following his daughter's miraculous recovery, had abandoned his family, and disappeared into the wilderness. Marcus had filed the missing person report himself, had organized search parties, had walked every inch of the woods surrounding the bridge. But he'd never found a body, never found evidence of foul play, never found anything except an increasingly strong conviction that something was protecting those woods, keeping its secrets buried under layers of shadow and silence. Luna Alvarez was 19, a sophomore at the University of North Texas, studying cultural anthropology with a focus on regional folklore. She'd grown up hearing stories about Goatman's Bridge from her grandmother, tales that mixed Mexican brujeria with Texas legends, creating a hybrid mythology that fascinated her academic mind while unsettling something deeper, more primal. Luna had a gift that she'd never discussed with anyone except her abuela, a sensitivity to the supernatural that allowed her to see things others missed, to feel the presence of entities that existed in the margins. She'd felt something calling to her from the bridge for months now, a pull that grew stronger with each passing week, and she'd finally decided to answer it, to document whatever she found for her senior thesis, assuming she survived the experience. Elijah Cross was 67 and dying, though only his oncologist knew the specifics. The cancer in his lungs was aggressive, inoperable, a price for 60 years of unfiltered cigarettes and filtered truths. He'd been Denton's unofficial historian for 4 decades, had collected stories and documented events that the official record preferred to forget. His home was a repository of local legends, his filing cabinets bulging with newspaper clippings, interview transcripts, and photographs that captured things cameras shouldn't be able to see. Elijah had known about the keeper longer than anyone currently living, had watched 3 people make the bargain over his lifetime, had witnessed the transformations and understood the terrible mathematics of the exchange. He'd kept silent because some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, but now, with death approaching on quiet feet, he'd decided it was time to pass on what he knew, to give someone else the burden of knowledge before he took his final breath. Thomas had learned to recognize the different types of people who came to his bridge. There were the thrill-seekers, teenagers drunk on cheap beer and cheaper courage, who came to test local legends and usually fled screaming before getting close enough to confirm anything. There were the true believers, paranormal investigators with their EVP recorders and thermal cameras, who treated the bridge like a theme park attraction and never understood they were trespassing on sacred, terrible ground. There were the desperate, people like he'd been, drawn by whispered rumors of something that could change fate, fix broken lives, grant impossible wishes. Those were the ones Thomas watched most carefully, the ones he had to turn away before they made the same mistake he had, before they traded their humanity for a prison sentence disguised as salvation. But Sarah Chen was different. Thomas had felt her arrival like a change in atmospheric pressure, a disturbance in the fabric that separated his cursed existence from the human world he could no longer inhabit. She'd come to the bridge at sunset, that liminal hour when boundaries grew soft and the veil between realities thinned to gossamer. She hadn't brought cameras or recording equipment, had simply stood at the western edge of the bridge with her eyes closed, breathing in the complex scent of water and decay, and something older than both. Thomas had watched from the tree line, his enhanced senses cataloguing everything about her, the elevated heart rate that suggested fear mixed with anticipation, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of suppressed grief, the way she carried herself like someone who'd learned to move through the world with her defenses always raised. When she finally opened her eyes and looked directly at where he stood hidden among the shadows, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years: recognition. Not the terrified acknowledgement of a monster, but the knowing gaze of someone who saw past the fur and horns to the remnant of humanity struggling to survive beneath. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She simply said, "I know you're there. I know you're more than what the stories say. Can I think you might know what happened to my brother?" Her words hit Thomas like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of the life he'd left behind, the conversations he could no longer have, the humanity he'd sacrificed. He wanted to stay hidden, to maintain the distance that made his existence bearable, but something in her voice, something in the way she stood there waiting with the patience of someone who'd already learned that answers rarely came quickly or easily, made him step forward into the dying light. He watched her face as she processed his appearance, saw fear flicker across her features before being replaced by something that looked almost like compassion. She was stronger than she looked, this Sarah Chen, braver than most who encountered him. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice steady despite the way her hands had clenched into fists at her sides. "My brother was David Chen. He disappeared 7 years ago, 3 months and 2 weeks ago. He came to this bridge and never came home." The dates aligned with Thomas's transformation, with the keeper's departure, and Thomas felt a cold understanding settle over him like frost. He couldn't speak, not in any way humans would understand. His vocal cords had been altered into something that could only produce the screams and roars that had given the legend its power. But he could show her, could lead her to the truth she'd been seeking, even if that truth would shatter what remained of her hope. Marcus Washington's truck pulled up at the bridge entrance just as full darkness settled over the landscape, his headlights cutting through shadows that seemed to resist illumination. He'd gotten a call from one of his deputies about a vehicle parked near the bridge, a rental car with California plates, and something about the timing had made his old instincts flare to life. Marcus had learned to trust those instincts, especially where this bridge was concerned, especially on nights when the air felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. He approached on foot, his hand resting on his weapon, not because he expected to use it, but because the weight was comforting, a reminder that he still operated in a world governed by laws and logic, even when everything around him suggested otherwise. What he saw when he rounded the final curve stopped him in his tracks. A woman, young and Asian, stood in the middle of the bridge in apparent conversation with something that Marcus's mind struggled to categorize. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with curved horns that caught the moonlight and threw it back in fractured patterns. But it was the way the creature stood, the posture and bearing that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. He'd seen that stance before, that particular way of holding tension in the shoulders, of tilting the head when listening intently. He'd seen it 1,000 times in his best friend, in Thomas Whitmore, the man who'd vanished from the same spot where this impossible being now stood. Thomas. The name escaped Marcus's lips before his rational mind could stop it, carried across the distance between them on a breeze that tasted like memory and loss. The creature's head snapped toward him, and Marcus saw eyes that held too much intelligence, too much pain, too much of the man he'd once known. Those eyes confirmed what his heart had somehow always suspected, that Thomas hadn't run away, hadn't abandoned his family, hadn't chosen to disappear. He'd been transformed, had been trapped in this nightmare existence, and Marcus had been too blind, too rational, too committed to the rules of the world he thought he understood, to see the truth that had been waiting here all along. Sarah turned to face the newcomer, her journalist's instincts quickly cataloguing details: sheriff's uniform, late 50s, eyes that held recognition when they looked at the creature beside her. "You know him," she said, not a question, but a statement. "You know what he was before?" Marcus nodded slowly, his hand falling away from his weapon, because what good would bullets do against the supernatural, against transformations that rewrote reality's rules? Thomas Whitmore. Best friend I ever had. Disappeared 7 years ago after his daughter recovered from terminal leukemia. Everyone thought he'd had a breakdown, run away from the pressure. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the creature's face. But he didn't run, did he? He made some kind of deal. The pieces were assembling themselves, the puzzle Sarah had been trying to solve for years finally taking shape. 7 years ago, she said slowly. That's when my brother disappeared. That's when the sightings of the GOATMAN changed, became more frequent, more consistent. She looked at Thomas, at the being who'd once been a man named Thomas, and asked the question that had been burning in her chest since she was 21 years old, and the police had called to say David was gone. "Did you see what happened to him? Do you know where he is?" Thomas moved then, his hooved feet making sounds against the bridge's wooden planks that seemed to echo, not just in the present, but in the past and future simultaneously. He gestured with one transformed hand toward the woods on the eastern side of the bridge, toward a darkness that seemed denser than it should be, more absolute. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances, a wordless agreement passing between them, and followed as Thomas led them off the bridge and into the trees. Luna Alvarez had planned to arrive at the bridge after midnight, when her research suggested paranormal activity reached its peak. But the pull she'd been feeling all day had become unbearable by 10 p.m., a pressure in her chest that made breathing difficult. She'd grabbed her backpack, told her roommate she was going to the library, and driven to Old Alton Bridge with the windows down and Spanish radio playing loud enough to drown out the voice in her head that said this was a terrible idea. Luna's gift had always been equal parts blessing and curse, allowing her to perceive the supernatural while offering no protection against it. showing her the shadows without giving her any light to dispel them. The scene she encountered when she arrived was not what she'd expected. A sheriff's vehicle sat parked at the entrance, lights off but engine still ticking as it cooled. A rental car beside it with California plates. And voices, coming from the woods beyond the bridge, speaking in urgent, low tones. Luna's gift flared to life, showing her auras and energy patterns that overlaid the physical world like a second sight. She saw 3 human presences, their life forces glowing with varying intensities, and something else, something that registered as both living and not, human and not, present and absent. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her memory, stories about beings that existed in between states, guardians of thresholds who'd paid terrible prices for their positions. She followed the voices into the woods, her feet finding paths that shouldn't exist, trails that appeared and disappeared based on intention rather than geography. Luna had learned to trust her gift, even when it terrified her, to let it guide her toward the truths that hid behind the world's mundane surface. The woods grew denser, older, the trees taking on shapes that predated human cultivation, their roots forming patterns that suggested purpose and design. She heard water running somewhere ahead, but it didn't sound like Hickory Creek. The flow was too regular, too rhythmic, like a heartbeat rather than a natural current. Luna emerged into a clearing she knew with absolute certainty had never appeared on any map. At its center stood a structure that hurt to look at directly, a framework of bone and wood, and something that might have been metal or might have been fossilized flesh, arranged in geometries that defied Euclidean logic. The 3 people she'd been following stood frozen at the clearing's edge. A middle-aged sheriff with his hand on his weapon, a young Asian woman with a camera around her neck, and a massive creature that matched every description Luna had collected of the GOATMAN, but somehow also matched nothing, because descriptions couldn't capture the profound sadness that emanated from it, like heat from a dying star. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice tight with tension. "This isn't safe." But Luna felt her gift pulling her forward, felt the clearing recognize her in some fundamental way, and she understood with the clarity that sometimes came with her visions that she was meant to witness whatever was about to unfold. "I'm Luna Alvarez," she said, stepping fully into the clearing. "And I think I'm supposed to be here. I think we all are." The structure at the clearing's center began to pulse with light that came from no visible source, illuminating details that had been hidden in shadow. Symbols covered its surface, languages that predated written human communication, equations that described relationships between life and death, between choice and consequence. And there, at the structure's base, partially obscured by vegetation that had grown up around it, Sarah saw something that made her knees buckle, a backpack, faded and weathered by 7 years of exposure, with a patch sewn onto it that read UC Berkeley Mountaineering Club. David's backpack, the one he'd been carrying when he disappeared. Sarah stumbled forward, her hands reaching for the pack before Marcus could stop her, and the moment her fingers made contact with the worn fabric, the clearing exploded with light and memory. Images flooded her consciousness, not her memories but David's, experiences recorded somehow in the fabric itself, or in the strange energy that permeated this place. She saw her brother arriving at the bridge 7 years ago, saw him drawn to the clearing just as she'd been, saw him encounter not Thomas, but the previous keeper, the entity that had inhabited this cursed existence before offering Thomas the terrible bargain. David had been sick, Sarah realized with a shock that felt like ice water in her veins. He'd been hiding it from everyone, had come to Texas specifically to seek out the legend, to find a cure that medical science couldn't provide. The entity had offered him the same choice it had offered Thomas, be healed in exchange for taking its place, become the guardian and let it finally rest. But David had refused, had understood somehow that the price was too high, that eternity as a monster was worse than mortality as a man. The entity had been furious at the rejection, had prepared to simply take what it wanted, to force the transformation, when something unexpected had happened. Thomas Whitmore had arrived, desperate and determined, willing to pay any price for his daughter's life. The entity had released David, had let the young man flee into the woods, disoriented and traumatized but human, and had turned its attention to the easier mark. Sarah felt David's final moments in the clearing, felt him running through darkness, felt him emerge miles away with no memory of how he'd gotten there, felt him board a bus to California with nothing but a conviction that he needed to leave Texas and never return. He was alive. Somewhere in California, living under an assumed name because he couldn't explain his lost time or the nightmares that woke him screaming, David Chen was alive. Sarah collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the contradictory emotions of relief and rage and grief for the 7 years she'd spent searching for a brother who deliberately stayed hidden to protect himself from memories he couldn't process. She felt hands on her shoulders, Luna kneeling beside her, offering support without understanding the full context. "He's alive," Sarah managed to say through her tears. "He's alive, and he's been in California the whole time." Marcus was staring at Thomas with a mixture of horror and understanding that came from finally seeing the complete picture. "You saved him," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That thing was going to transform David, was going to trap him the way it's trapped you, and you offered yourself instead." Thomas's massive head nodded once, a gesture that retained enough humanity to be unmistakable, and Marcus felt something break inside his chest. His best friend hadn't abandoned anyone, hadn't run from responsibility, hadn't chosen this nightmare. He'd walked into it willingly to save a stranger and his own daughter, had sacrificed everything, and Marcus had spent 7 years thinking the worst of him. Luna's gift was showing her layers of reality that the others couldn't perceive, revealing the true nature of the clearing and the structure at its center. This wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon or a local anomaly. It was a prison, specifically designed to hold beings like Thomas, to trap them in service to the boundary between worlds. But it was also failing, the structure's integrity degrading after centuries of use, the bindings that held Thomas growing weaker with each passing year. She could see fractures in the energy patterns, weak points where reality's membrane had grown thin from constant strain. "He's breaking free," she said aloud, not even realizing she was speaking. The prison wasn't designed to hold someone for eternity. It was meant to be temporary, a way station. But something went wrong. The transfers stopped happening the way they were supposed to, and now it's collapsing. The implications hit all of them simultaneously. If the prison collapsed with Thomas still bound to it, he would be torn apart, his essence scattered across dimensions. But if it collapsed after he broke free, the boundary it was designed to protect would fail, and things from the other side would come flooding through. They were standing at the epicenter of a catastrophe that would make every horror movie seem tame by comparison, and none of them had the first idea how to stop it. Elijah Cross's truck rattled into the clearing at just past 11 p.m., the old historian having felt a familiar pull, a calling that had drawn him to this spot during previous crises. He climbed out slowly, his body protesting every movement, and surveyed the scene with eyes that had witnessed too many impossible things to be surprised by anything anymore. He saw Marcus Washington, which made sense given the sheriff's connection to Thomas. He saw 2 young women he didn't recognize, but whose presence felt right in ways he couldn't explain. And he saw Thomas Whitmore transformed but still recognizable to someone who knew what to look for, trapped in the curse that Elijah had watched claim others before him. "You came," Elijah said, addressing the group as a whole, but keeping his eyes on Thomas. "Good. That means there's still a chance to fix this before it's too late." He pulled a worn leather journal from his truck's cab, its pages yellowed and fragile, filled with handwriting from multiple sources spanning decades. "I've been documenting this place since before any of you were born. Been watching the patterns, tracking the cycles, trying to understand the rules that govern the bargain." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, revealing a sketch of the structure at the clearing center drawn with scientific precision. This prison, this guardian post, it was never meant to be permanent. The original design called for a transfer every 7 years, one guardian replaced by another in an endless chain. But something interrupted the chain 70 years ago, during the war. The guardian who was supposed to be replaced refused to let go, clung to the curse because they'd lost everyone they loved in the human world and had nothing to go back to. They held on for 23 years before the strain killed them, and in the process they corrupted the entire system. Elijah coughed, a wet sound that brought blood to his lips, and continued speaking through the pain. Since then, every transfer has been forced, violent, incomplete. The entity that held this post before Thomas, it wasn't supposed to be able to offer the bargain. It was supposed to serve its 7 years and be released. But the corruption let it stay longer, let it accumulate power it should never have had. When Thomas took its place, he inherited not just the curse, but all the accumulated damage to the system. Luna was frantically taking notes, her academic training kicking in despite the supernatural circumstances. So what you're saying is that Thomas is essentially holding together a structure that's been failing for 7 decades, and when it finally collapses, it won't just free him, it'll destroy the entire boundary mechanism. Elijah nodded, clearly impressed by her quick comprehension. Exactly. And we have maybe 48 hours before catastrophic failure. I can feel it in my bones, literally. The structure is hemorrhaging energy, and when it goes, everything within a 50-mile radius becomes a soft spot where the walls between worlds break down completely. Sarah had recovered enough to stand, though her legs still felt shaky. There has to be a way to stop it, some kind of ritual or process that can repair the damage. But even as she said it, she saw Elijah shaking his head. The only way to repair it would require someone to willingly take Thomas's place with full knowledge of what they're accepting, and the transfer would have to be done correctly this time, following protocols that were lost decades ago. I've got the basics written down here, he tapped the journal, but it's incomplete. And even if we could figure out the missing pieces, who would volunteer for an eternity of this? He gestured at Thomas, at the being who'd once been a man, trapped in a form that was neither animal nor human, bound to a place that existed between states. Marcus felt the weight of impossible choices settling over him like a physical burden. He looked at his transformed friend, at the suffering visible in Thomas's eyes despite the monstrous exterior, and thought about Rebecca and Emma, the family Thomas had sacrificed everything to protect. They thought him dead, had held a memorial service 3 years ago when the court had finally declared him legally deceased. What would it do to them to learn the truth? Would knowing he was still alive, still conscious and aware but trapped in this nightmare, be better or worse than believing he'd found peace in death? We need to gather everyone who might have information about the original transfer protocols, Luna said, her voice taking on the authority of someone who'd found their purpose. Local historians, indigenous elders, anyone with knowledge of the area's supernatural history. If the protocols existed once, fragments of them must have survived somewhere. Elijah was already nodding. I know 3 people who might be able to help. One is a Wichita medicine woman in her 90s who grew up hearing stories from her grandmother. Another is a folklorist at TCU who specializes in frontier-era mysticism. The third is in a psychiatric facility because no one believed what they witnessed here 15 years ago, but they're lucid and they remember. Sarah wiped her eyes, forcing herself back into journalist mode, channeling her emotions into action. I can reach out to my contacts in the paranormal research community. There are databases of historical accounts, forums where people share family stories that were never officially recorded. If we cast a wide enough net, we might find something useful. She looked at Marcus. You have access to police archives going back to the town's founding, right? Old case files, incident reports, anything that might reference the bridge or unexplained disappearances in this area. Marcus was already mentally cataloging resources, thinking like the investigator he'd been trained to be. I can pull everything we have going back to 1895 when the bridge was built. And I know the librarian at the County Historical Society. She's got newspaper archives on microfiche that include stories too strange for the official record, but too persistent to ignore completely. He paused, then added, but even if we find the protocols, we still need someone willing to take Thomas's place. And I can't ask anyone to make that sacrifice. You won't have to ask, Elijah said quietly. I'm dying anyway. Lung cancer, stage 4, maybe 3 months left if I'm lucky. 3 months of pain and degradation, watching my body fail piece by piece. He straightened despite the obvious cost, meeting Marcus's eyes with a clarity that left no room for argument. I've spent my whole life documenting these events, watching people suffer, and doing nothing to help because I was too afraid of what it might cost me. This is my chance to finally matter, to use my death for something more than a statistic in an oncologist's file. The clearing seemed to hold its breath, the structure at its center pulsing with a rhythm that matched their collective heartbeats. Thomas made a sound, not quite a roar but not human speech either, a noise that conveyed protest and gratitude and desperation in equal measure. He moved closer to Elijah, his massive form somehow conveying gentleness, and placed one transformed hand on the old historian's shoulder. The gesture was pure Thomas, the kind veterinarian who'd always had a gift for communicating without words, and it nearly broke Marcus's composure completely. "We have 48 hours, Luna said, pulling out her phone and starting to create a shared document. "Let's organize. Who's handling what research angle, and when do we reconvene to pool our findings?" The group began to coordinate, to divide responsibilities and establish timelines, operating with the focused efficiency of people who understood that failure wasn't an option. They would find the protocols, would repair what had been broken, and would free Thomas even if it meant condemning another soul to the prison in his place. It was an impossible task with a deadline measured in hours instead of days, but they were going to attempt it anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. As dawn approached and the group finally dispersed to begin their research, Thomas remained in the clearing, his prison and his post, watching the sky lighten from black to grey. He thought about Emma, wondered if she could feel through their connection that something was changing, that the father she thought dead might soon be truly free or truly destroyed. He thought about Rebecca, about the life they'd built together before cancer, and desperation had torn it all apart. And he thought about Elijah, the old man who was willing to trade 3 months of life for an eternity of service, and wondered if he had the right to accept such a sacrifice. The sun broke the horizon, sending spears of light through the trees, and Thomas felt the structure around him groan with the strain of containing energies it was never designed to hold indefinitely. Cracks appeared in the geometry, hairline fractures that leaked something that looked like light but felt like screaming. The countdown had begun, and whether they succeeded or failed, Thomas Whitmore's existence was about to change irrevocably. He just hoped that when it was over, whatever form he took or didn't take, he would still be able to feel that golden thread connecting him to his daughter, the only thing that had kept him sane through 7 years of impossible solitude. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of research, revelation, and rising desperation. Luna coordinated with 3 indigenous knowledge keepers who agreed to share information that their peoples had protected for generations. The Wichita medicine woman, whose name was Morning Dove and who was 93 years old, spoke of the original boundary keepers, beings who had volunteered to stand watch at thin places in the world where spirits could cross between realms. The position was supposed to be one of honor, a sacred duty undertaken willingly, with the understanding that service would last exactly 7 years before another volunteer took their place. "The problem began when your people came," Morning Dove said, her voice still strong despite her age. "When settlers pushed into these lands with their guns and their god, they disrupted the old agreements. They killed some of the keepers, thinking them demons or monsters. They drove others away from their posts, leaving the boundaries unguarded. The spirits that maintained the cycle were forced to adapt, to find new keepers among the settlers themselves. But your people didn't understand the honor of the position. They saw it as a curse instead of a calling." Sarah spent hours in digital archives, cross-referencing accounts of disappearances near the bridge, with historical records of similar phenomena worldwide. She found a pattern. Every 7 years, like clockwork, someone would vanish near Old Alton Bridge, and roughly a month later, sightings of the GOATMAN would begin in earnest. The cycle had been operating since at least 1863, possibly earlier, though records from before that period were too fragmentary to confirm. Most telling was what happened in 1952. No disappearance, no new sightings, just intensifying reports of the existing GOATMAN becoming increasingly aggressive and unstable over the next 2 decades. Marcus's deep dive into police archives revealed something that made his blood run cold. The psychiatric patient Elijah had mentioned, a man named Jonathan Reeves, had been institutionalized in 2010 after claiming he'd witnessed a transfer ceremony at the bridge. According to his statement, given before sedatives had reduced him to incoherence, He'd seen two beings struggling in the clearing, one trying desperately to force the curse onto the other, while strange lights and impossible sounds filled the air. The description matched what Thomas must have experienced when he encountered the previous keeper, the entity that had been holding the position for far too long. Marcus drove to the facility where Reeves was housed, pulled strings with the staff psychiatrist, and sat across from a man whose eyes held the particular emptiness of someone who'd seen too much and been disbelieved too often. But when Marcus mentioned the bridge, mentioned Thomas and the coming collapse, Reeves came alive with a lucidity that suggested his delusions had always been accurate observations that no one wanted to acknowledge. "The transfer requires 3 elements," Reeves said, leaning forward with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Willing consent from both parties, a witness who understands the true nature of the exchange, and an offering of blood at the moment of sunset, when the boundary is thinnest. The previous keeper, the one who corrupted everything, they skipped the consent part. They just forced it, and that's why everything since then has been broken." Luna compiled the information from all sources into a comprehensive document that read like instructions for a ritual that belonged in a fantasy novel rather than reality. She'd found confirmation in 3 separate cultural traditions: the Wichita Protocols that Morning Dove had shared, a German settler's journal from 1887 that described witnessing a similar ceremony in Bavaria, and a collection of letters from a Spanish missionary who documented indigenous practices in Texas before the Revolution. The commonalities were striking and specific. The transfer had to occur at sunset, had to involve an explicit statement of willing acceptance from the new keeper and willing release from the old keeper, required a witness who could see both the physical and spiritual aspects of the exchange, and needed to be sealed with blood, drawn at the precise moment the sun dropped below the horizon. They reconvened in the clearing as the 48-hour deadline approached its final 12 hours. The structure at the center was visibly deteriorating now, chunks of its impossible architecture crumbling away and dissolving into smoke that smelled like burnt copper and regret. Thomas was weakening too, his movements sluggish, his form flickering occasionally, as if he couldn't maintain cohesion in the face of the collapsing prison. The golden thread that connected him to Emma was fraying, becoming intermittent, and the loss of that connection terrified him more than the prospect of dissolution. Elijah arrived with his affairs in order, having spent the last day and a half writing letters to the few people who mattered to him, arranging for his collections to be donated to institutions that would preserve them, and making peace with a God he'd stopped believing in decades ago, but found himself addressing anyway in his final hours. He looked at Thomas and said, "I'm ready. Tell me what I need to do." But Luna was shaking her head, her gift showing her something the others couldn't see. "It won't work with Elijah," she said, her voice thick with frustration and fear. "The witness has to be someone who can perceive the supernatural, who can actually see the energy transfer happening and confirm its completion. That's me. I'm the only one here with that ability." She looked at the old historian with genuine sorrow. "You can't be both witness and participant. We need another volunteer." The words landed like stones into still water, ripples of understanding spreading outward. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he realized what was being asked, what the situation demanded. He looked at Thomas, at his best friend, who'd already sacrificed everything, who deserved to be free, and thought about Rebecca and Emma, about the family that still mourned his loss. Then he thought about his own life, about his ex-wife who'd remarried years ago, about his grown children who had their own families now and saw him mostly on holidays. He thought about all the cases he'd never solved, all the families he'd failed, all the ways his life had been defined by being too late to save people who'd needed him. "I'll do it," Marcus said, the words coming out stronger than he felt. "I'll take the position." Thomas made a sound that could only be described as anguished, his massive head shaking violently in negation. "I know," Marcus continued, speaking directly to his friend. "I know you don't want this for me. But look at our options, Tom. Elijah's dying anyway, but he's the only one besides Luna who has the knowledge to guide future seekers away from this place, to prevent others from stumbling into the same trap you did. Sarah has to find her brother, has to reconnect with the family she thought she'd lost. Luna's got her whole life ahead of her, decades of potential we can't just throw away." He stepped closer, close enough to place his hand on Thomas's furred arm. But me? I'm 52 years old, divorced, distanced from my kids, and the only thing I've ever been really good at is being a cop. This way, I get to protect people for real, get to be the guardian I always wanted to be, and I get to do it knowing that my best friend gets to go home. Sarah was crying openly now, thinking about the irony of spending 7 years searching for her lost brother, only to watch someone else sacrifice themselves for a stranger's freedom. "There has to be another way," she said, though her voice held no conviction. "Some loophole or alternative that we're missing." But even as she spoke, she could feel the structure's collapse accelerating, could sense that they were out of time for creative solutions. Luna pulled out the compiled protocols, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed the requirements one final time. "We need to do this at sunset tonight," she said. "That gives us about 6 hours to prepare, to make sure we understand every step of the ritual. Because we'll only get one chance. If we mess this up, both Marcus and Thomas could be destroyed, and the boundary will fail anyway." She looked at each of them in turn. "Everyone needs to be absolutely certain about this decision. Once we start, there's no going back." The hours before sunset were spent in meticulous preparation. Luna created a diagram of where each participant needed to stand, marking positions with stones she'd blessed, according to her grandmother's instructions. Sarah documented everything with her camera, creating a record of the ritual that future researchers might need if something similar ever happened again. Elijah transferred all his knowledge to Luna in a marathon session of questions and answers, teaching her everything he knew about the bridge, the boundary, and the entities that had served as keepers over the decades. Marcus called his ex-wife, had a conversation that was simultaneously mundane and profound, telling her that he loved her despite their divorce and was proud of the life she'd built. He called his children, listened to their voices one last time, and said things that sounded like ordinary fatherly advice, but were actually goodbyes disguised as everyday wisdom. He wrote a letter explaining his decision, addressed to the sheriff's department, but really meant for anyone who cared enough to wonder what had happened to Marcus Washington after he disappeared near Old Alton Bridge. Thomas spent the time trying to memorize every detail of the clearing, every sensation of existence, as something other than human, preparing himself for a transformation back to humanity that he'd stopped believing would ever come. He thought about what he would say to Rebecca, to Emma, how he would explain 7 years of absence and transformation. He practiced moving his fingers, or what passed for fingers in his current form, trying to remember how to manipulate objects with hands instead of hooves, how to form words with a tongue and lips instead of only screaming and roaring. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they gathered in their assigned positions. Thomas stood at the structure's eastern point, Marcus at the west, Luna directly between them, where she could observe both simultaneously. Sarah and Elijah positioned themselves at the clearing's edge as witnesses to the physical aspects of the ritual. The air grew thick with anticipation, charged with an energy that made their hair stand on end and their skin prickle with static. Luna began to speak, her voice resonating with power she hadn't known she possessed, words in a language she'd never learned but somehow understood, flowing from her mouth. She called upon the spirits of the boundary, upon the original agreement that had established the keeper position, upon the forces that maintained separation between worlds. The structure began to glow, its deteriorating architecture temporarily stabilizing as ancient mechanisms engaged for the first time in decades. Marcus stepped forward when Luna signaled, his voice clear and steady as he spoke the words of willing acceptance. "I, Marcus Washington of sound mind and willing heart, accept the mantle of keeper. I offer myself to stand watch at the boundary, to guard the threshold between worlds, to serve for the appointed term with honor and purpose." His blood, drawn by a knife Luna had prepared according to precise specifications, dripped onto the ground at the exact moment the sun touched the horizon. Thomas's turn came next, and though he couldn't form human words, Luna had prepared for this, had learned how to interpret the sounds he could make. Through a combination of Luna's translation and Thomas's desperate effort to communicate consent, the words of willing release emerged. "I, Thomas Whitmore, release my bond to this position. I surrender the mantle willingly, with gratitude for the one who takes my place, with recognition of the sacrifice being made." More blood, drawn from what had been his hand, but was now something else mixed with Marcus's on the ground. The energy transfer began, visible to Luna as streams of light and darkness flowing from Thomas's body into Marcus's, a process that looked beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Thomas screamed, a sound of agony and relief mixed together as the curse unraveled from his cells, from his DNA, from the fundamental structure of his being. His body began to shift, horns receding, fur falling away, hooves splitting and reforming into hands and feet. The transformation reversed itself in minutes, what had taken hours to establish, unmaking the monster and restoring the man. But Marcus was experiencing the opposite, feeling his body rebel against changes that violated every law of biology and physics. His bones elongated and curved, his spine reconfigured itself into new arrangements. His hands and feet hardened into hooves that would never again hold a pen or walk on two legs in quite the same way. The pain was exquisite, was transcendent, was everything the protocols had warned it would be. But underneath the agony, Marcus felt something else, a profound connection to the boundary, an awareness of the membrane between worlds that suddenly made sense of everything he'd experienced in his life. All the hunches and instincts that had made him a good cop now revealed as sensitivity to the supernatural he'd possessed, without understanding it. Luna maintained her position, her gift allowing her to see the transfer in its entirety, to confirm that the energy was flowing correctly, that the protocols were being followed to the letter. She saw Marcus's human essence compress and crystallize at the core of his new form, protecting what made him himself even as everything external changed. She saw Thomas's humanity expand and reassert itself, cells remembering their original configuration and snapping back into human patterns. And she saw the structure stabilize, the cracks sealing themselves as power flowed into it from Marcus's willing sacrifice, the boundary reinforcing itself as it was always meant to when maintained by someone who chose to serve rather than being forced into slavery. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the ritual completed with a thunderclap that shook the ground and sent birds fleeing from trees in all directions. Thomas collapsed onto earth as a naked, shivering man, his body unfamiliar after 7 years of being something else, his mind struggling to process human sensation after so long experiencing reality through altered senses. Sarah rushed forward with the blanket they'd brought, wrapping it around him, supporting his weight as he tried to remember how to stand on 2 legs. Marcus stood transformed, his new body similar to what Thomas's had been but somehow different, shaped by his own essence in ways that made the curse uniquely his. But his eyes were still human, still intelligent and aware, and when he looked at Thomas, he smiled with a muzzle that shouldn't have been able to form that expression, but did anyway. Luna approached cautiously, reading the energy patterns around him, and confirmed what they all needed to hear. The transfer was successful. The boundary is stable. Marcus is the keeper now, and he's protected by the proper protocols. 7 years from now, if we can find another willing volunteer, he can be released just like Thomas was. Elijah was making notes frantically, documenting every detail while his failing body still allowed it. This was his legacy, his final contribution to the knowledge he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. When it was done, when the last observation was recorded, he looked at Marcus in his transformed state and said, "Thank you. Thank you for giving this old fool a chance to see his research actually save someone instead of just documenting tragedies after they happened." Thomas's first words in 7 years were rasped and broken, his vocal cords having to remember how to shape human language. Marcus. Why? His friend, now a monster in his place, settled into a seated position that somehow still conveyed the essence of the man he'd been. Luna translated his response, the growls and grunts that Thomas had used, now coming from Marcus's throat. "Because you would have done the same for me. Because that's what friends do. Because someone had to stand guard, and I'm tired of showing up too late to help." The journey back to the world took 3 days. Thomas needed time to learn how to be human again, to navigate a body that felt foreign despite being his original form. His hands shook when he tried to hold things, his legs buckled unexpectedly, his senses felt muted and limited after years of supernatural perception. But slowly, with patient help from Sarah and Luna, he remembered. He remembered how to eat with utensils instead of tearing into food. He remembered how to speak in full sentences instead of roars and screams. He remembered what it felt like to look at his reflection and see a face instead of a monster. Luna stayed at the bridge with Marcus for the first week, helping him adjust to his new existence, teaching him what she'd learned about managing the boundary and interpreting the supernatural events he could now perceive. She promised to visit regularly, to be his connection to the human world, to ensure he didn't become isolated and corrupted the way previous keepers had. They established a schedule. Every full moon she would come to the clearing and they would talk, would share information, would maintain the human connection that was essential to Marcus's long-term survival as a guardian. Sarah helped Thomas navigate the impossible task of returning to his family. They couldn't just show up at Rebecca's door after 7 years. The shock could be devastating, the questions impossible to answer honestly. Instead, they crafted a story about amnesia and recovery, about Thomas being found wandering in Oregon with no memory of how he'd gotten there, about months of treatment before his identity was finally established and he could make his way home. It was a lie, but it was a lie that protected Emma from truths that would damage her, that allowed Rebecca to believe in something resembling a rational explanation. The reunion happened on a Tuesday, which seemed fitting somehow, the same day of the week when Thomas's original transformation had begun. Rebecca opened the door of the house Thomas had left 7 years ago, the house where he'd raised Emma and built a life, and she saw him standing there, older and thinner and marked by experiences he could never fully explain, but unmistakably alive. She didn't cry at first, was too shocked for tears, could only stare at him with eyes that tried to reconcile memory with reality. Then Emma came down the stairs, 15 now instead of 8, a young woman instead of a dying child, and when she saw him, the golden thread between them sang with recognition. "Dad?" Her voice was uncertain, hopeful, afraid. Thomas nodded, his own voice failing him, and Emma ran to him, threw her arms around him with the fierce strength of someone who'd spent 7 years being told he was dead and could finally prove all those voices wrong. Rebecca joined them, the three of them standing in the doorway, crying and holding each other, and Thomas felt the prison of his curse finally, completely break. He was home. He was human. He was free. But freedom came with costs he was still discovering. Thomas would wake screaming some nights, his body remembering transformations that his mind tried to forget. He struggled to reconnect with a daughter who'd grown up without him, who'd developed into a person he barely knew. His relationship with Rebecca was different now, marked by 7 years of absence and the lies he had to maintain about where he'd been. He couldn't practice veterinary medicine anymore. His hands had lost the steady precision they'd once possessed, and his heightened awareness of animal suffering, a residue from his time as something other than human, made it unbearable to work with sick or injured creatures. But he was alive. He could feel sunshine on his skin without the barrier of fur. He could speak his daughter's name and hear her respond. He could choose when to walk on 2 legs and when to rest. And every full moon, when Luna visited the bridge to check on Marcus, Thomas would drive out there too, would stand at the clearing's edge and talk to his friend in the darkness, would express gratitude that words could never adequately convey. Marcus found his own equilibrium with the curse, discovered that it wasn't just a prison, but also a calling that suited him in ways his human life never had. As a sheriff, he'd always felt constrained by laws and procedures, by the need to prove things in court and work within systems that too often failed the people who needed protection most. As the boundary keeper, he could simply act, could protect without paperwork, could guard without jurisdictional limits. He learned to see the entities that tried to cross the threshold, to discern which ones meant harm and which were simply lost souls looking for passage. He became a legend again, but this time he was writing his own story instead of having it forced upon him. Sarah found her brother 3 months after the ritual, tracked him down to a small apartment in Oakland where he lived under the name David Miller and worked as a graphic designer. Their reunion was quieter than Thomas's, marked by 7 years of David's deliberate absence and Sarah's persistent searching. He'd built a life free from his past, had created an identity that had no connection to Texas or bridges or supernatural encounters, and Sarah's appearance, threatened that carefully constructed peace. But blood called to blood, family to family, and eventually David agreed to let her in, to hear the full story of what had happened at the bridge, to understand that his refusal had led to someone else's sacrifice, but also someone else's ultimate salvation. Luna completed her thesis on the boundary phenomenon at Old Alton Bridge, though she had to sanitize it significantly for academic consumption, removing the elements that were too true to be believed. She graduated with honors and was accepted into a graduate folklore program, where she could continue studying supernatural events through the safer lens of cultural narratives and collective beliefs. But once a month she returned to the clearing, kept her promise to Marcus, and documented the ongoing story of a man who'd chosen to become a monster so that monsters could be kept at bay. Elijah lived another 4 months, long enough to see Thomas reunited with his family, long enough to know that his life's work had finally mattered in a tangible way. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his carefully organized collections, his journals filled with observations that would guide future researchers if they were wise enough to pay attention. Luna inherited his archives and his mission, becoming the next keeper of knowledge about the boundary and the bridge. The closing months of the year brought changes to everyone involved in the ritual. Thomas began volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation center, finding that he could work with animals if he focused on healing instead of practicing medicine, on providing comfort instead of attempting cures. Rebecca slowly forgave him for leaving, for staying gone, for the lies he still had to maintain about where he'd been. Emma thrived, her health perfect, her future bright, unaware that her existence had cost 2 men their humanity, but grateful every day for a father who'd come back from the dead. Marcus developed a reputation among the supernatural community, becoming known as a fair but firm guardian who would grant passage to entities that meant no harm, but who showed no mercy to those that threatened the human world. He learned to communicate with Luna through methods that transcended words, developed a shorthand of sounds and gestures that allowed them to share complex information during her monthly visits, and sometimes, late at night, when the moon was dark and the boundary grew thin, he would remember being human, would remember driving a patrol car and filing reports and eating breakfast at diners where everyone knew his name. Those memories didn't hurt the way Thomas's did, didn't carry the weight of loss, because Marcus had chosen this existence with full knowledge of what it meant. The bridge itself became safer, paradoxically, because Marcus's presence discouraged the thrill-seekers and true believers who'd once treated it like a supernatural theme park. Word spread that the GOATMAN was different now, more active, more protective, more likely to chase away intruders than to simply watch from the shadows. Visitors dropped off, the legends evolved, and the bridge returned to being just a piece of local infrastructure that happened to span a creek in the woods outside Denton, Texas. But those who knew the truth understood that it was more than that. It was a threshold, a boundary marker, a place where the membrane between worlds required constant vigilance. It was a reminder that some sacrifices are necessary, that some guardians choose their posts, and that redemption sometimes requires becoming the very thing you once feared. Thomas Whitmore had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, had paid a price that would have destroyed lesser men, and had emerged on the other side still fundamentally himself, despite 7 years of being something else entirely. As winter settled over Texas, bringing rare cold that made the bridge's wooden planks contract and groan, Thomas stood at his bedroom window and looked toward the woods where his friend kept watch. The golden thread that had connected him to Emma during his years as the keeper had faded to nothing, replaced by the normal bonds of father and daughter, of shared genetics and chosen love. But sometimes in his quietest moments, Thomas swore he could feel a different thread, one that connected him to Marcus, to the man who'd taken his curse and transformed it into a calling. On Christmas Eve, Thomas drove out to the bridge, left Marcus's favorite coffee in a thermos at the clearing's edge, and spoke into the darkness about his day, about Emma's acceptance to college, about Rebecca's smile when she looked at him, about all the small miracles of ordinary life that he'd fought so hard to reclaim. Marcus didn't respond in words, couldn't anymore, but Thomas felt his presence, felt his friend's satisfaction and peace, and understood that some guardians find their purpose in the most unexpected places. The screams that came from the old bridge were different now. They were no longer sounds of anguish or warning, but communications boundary markers that told entities where the line was drawn and what would happen if they crossed it. They were the voice of a guardian who'd chosen his post, who understood the weight of his responsibility, and who would stand watch for 7 years before another willing soul could set him free. They were the sound of sacrifice transformed into service, of curse becoming calling, of a monster who was more human than many men who walked on 2 legs and lived in the light. And in a house in Denton, a man who'd been that monster, who'd worn the curse and survived it, pulled his daughter close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for friends who would trade their humanity for another's freedom, for mysteries that resolved into meanings, and for bridges that connected not just one shore to another, but the possible to the impossible, the human to the divine, and the past to the future in an endless cycle of sacrifice and redemption.